Two Kinds by Amy Tan, Part 2. A few weeks later, old Chang and my mother conspired to have me play in a talent show that was to be held in the church hall. By then my parents had saved up enough to buy me a second-hand piano, a black Wurlitzer Spinet with a scarred bench. It was the showpiece of our living room. For the talent show, I was to play a piece called Pleading Child from Schumann's Scenes from Childhood. It was a simple, moody piece that sounded more difficult than it was. I was supposed to memorize the whole thing, but I dawdled over it, playing a few bars and then cheating, looking up to see what notes followed. I never really listened to what I was playing. I daydreamed about being somewhere else, about being someone else. The part I liked to practice best was the fancy curtsy. Right foot out, touch the rose on the carpet with a pointed foot, sweep to the side, bend left leg, look up and smile. My parents invited all the couples from their social club to witness my debut. Annie Lindo and Uncle Tin were there. Waverly and her two older brothers had also come. The first two rows were filled with children, either younger or older than I was. The little ones got to go first. They recited simple nursery rhymes, squawked out tunes on miniature violins, and twirled hula hoops in pink ballet tutus. And when they bowed or curtsied, the audience would sigh in unison, "Aww," and then clap enthusiastically. When my turn came, I was very confident. I remember my childish excitement. It was as if I knew without a doubt that the prodigy side of me really did exist. I had no fear whatsoever, no nervousness. I remember thinking, "This is it. This is it." I looked out over the audience at my mother's blank face, my father's yawn, Auntie Lindo's stiff-lipped smile, Waverly's sulky expression. I had on a white dress layered with sheets of lace and a pink bow on my Peter Pan haircut. As I sat down, I envisioned people jumping to their feet and Ed Sullivan rushing up to introduce me to everyone on TV. And I started to play. Everything was so beautiful. I was so caught up in how lovely I looked that I wasn't worried about how I would sound. So I was surprised when I hit the first wrong note. And then I hit another and another. A chill started at the top of my head and began to trickle down. Yet I couldn't stop playing, as though my hands were bewitched. I kept thinking my fingers would adjust themselves back, like a train switching to the right track. I played this strange jumble through to the end, the sour notes staying with me all the way. When I stood up, I discovered my legs were shaking. Maybe I had just been nervous and the audience, like old Chang, had seen me go through the right motions and had not heard anything wrong at all. I swept my right foot out, went down on my knee, looked up, and smiled. The room was quiet except for old Chang, who was beaming and shouting, "Bravo! Bravo! Well done!" By then I saw my mother's face, her stricken face. The audience clapped weakly, and I walked back to my chair with my whole face quivering as I tried not to cry. I heard a little boy whisper loudly to his mother, "That was awful," and the mother whispered, "Well, she certainly tried." And now I realized how many people were in the audience. The whole world, it seemed. I was aware of eyes burning into my back. I felt the shame of my mother and father as they sat stiffly through the rest of the show. We could have escaped during intermission. Pride and some strange sense of honor must have anchored my parents to their chairs. And so we watched it all, the 18-year-old boy with a fake mustache, who did a magic show and juggled flaming hoops while riding a unicycle, the breasted girl with white makeup who sang an aria from Madame Butterfly and got an honorable mention, and the 11-year-old boy who won first prize playing a tricky violin song that sounded like a busy bee. After the show, the Hughes and the Wongs and the St. Clairs from Joy Luck Club came up to my mother and father. "Lots of talented kids," Auntie Linda said vaguely, smiling broadly. "That was something else," my father said, and I wondered if he was referring to me in a humorous way, or whether he even remembered what I had done. Waverly looked at me and shrugged her shoulders. "You aren't a genius like me," she said matter-of-factly, "and if I hadn't felt so bad, I would have pulled her braids and punched her stomach." But my mother's expression was what devastated me, a quiet, blank look that said she had lost everything. I felt the same way, and everybody seemed now to be coming up, like gawkers at the scene of an accident, to see what parts were actually missing. When we got on the bus to go home, my father was humming the Busy Bee tune and my mother kept silent. I kept thinking she wanted to wait until we got home before shouting at me. But when my father unlocked the door to our apartment, my mother walked in and went straight to the back, into the bedroom. No accusations, no blame. And in a way, I felt disappointed. I had been waiting for her to start shouting, so that I could shout back and cry and blame her for all my misery. I had assumed that my talent show fiasco meant that I would never have to play the piano again. But 2 days later, after school, my mother came out of the kitchen and saw me watching TV. 4 o'clock, she reminded me, as if it were any other day. I was stunned, as though she were asking me to go through the talent show torture again. I planted myself more squarely in front of the TV. Turn off TV, she called from the kitchen 5 minutes later. I didn't budge, and then I decided I didn't have to do what my mother said anymore. I wasn't her slave. This wasn't China. I had listened to her before, and look what happened. She was the stupid one. She came out of the kitchen and stood in the arched entryway of the living room. 4 o'clock, she said once again louder. I'm not going to play any more, I said nonchalantly. Why should I? I'm not a genius. She stood in front of the TV. I saw her chest was heaving up and down in an angry way. No, I said, and I now felt stronger, as if my true self had finally emerged. So this was what had been inside me all along. No, I won't, I screamed. She snapped off the TV, yanked me by the arm, and pulled me off the floor. She was frighteningly strong, half pulling, half carrying me towards the piano as I kicked the throw rugs under my feet. She lifted me up onto the hard bench. I was sobbing by now, looking at her bitterly. Her chest was heaving even more, and her mouth was open, smiling crazily, as if she were pleased that I was crying. You want me to be something that I'm not, I sobbed. I'll never be the kind of daughter you want me to be. Only 2 kinds of daughters, she shouted in Chinese. Those who are obedient and those who follow their own mind. Only one kind of daughter can live in this house. Obedient daughter. Then I wish I weren't your daughter. I wish you weren't my mother, I shouted. As I said these things, I got scared. It felt like worms and toads and slimy things were crawling out of my chest, but it also felt good that this awful side of me had surfaced at last. Too late to change this, my mother said shrilly. And I could sense her anger rising to its breaking point. I wanted to see it spill over, and that's when I remembered the babies she had lost in China, the ones we never talked about. Then I wish I'd never been born, I shouted. I wish I were dead, like them. It was as if I had said magic words. Alakazam. Her face went blank, her mouth closed, her arms went slack, and she backed out of the room, stunned, as if she were blowing away like a small brown leaf, thin, brittle, lifeless. It was not only the disappointment my mother felt in me. In the years that followed, I failed her many times, each time asserting my will, my right to fall short of expectations. I didn't get straight A's. I didn't become class president. I didn't get into Stanford. I dropped out of college. For unlike my mother, I did not believe I could be anything I wanted to be. I could only be me. And for all those years we never talked about the disaster at the recital, or my terrible declarations afterward at the piano bench, neither of us talked about it again, as if it were a betrayal that was now unspeakable. So I never found a way to ask her why she had hoped for something so large that failure was inevitable. And even worse, I never asked her about what frightened me the most. Why had she given up hope? For after our struggle at the piano, she never mentioned my playing again. The lesson stopped. The lid to the piano was closed, shutting out the dust, my misery, and her dreams. So she surprised me. A few years ago, she offered to give me the piano for my 30th birthday. I had not played in all those years. I saw the offer as a sign of forgiveness, a tremendous burden removed. Are you sure? I asked shyly. I mean, won't you and Dad miss it? No, this is your piano, she said firmly. Always your piano. You only one can play. Well, I probably can't play any more, I said. It's been years. You pick up fast, my mother said, as if she knew this was certain. You have natural talent. You could be a genius if you want to. No, I couldn't. You just not trying, my mother said. And she was neither angry nor sad. She said it as if announcing a fact that could never be disproved. Take it, she said. But I didn't at first. It was enough that she had offered it to me. And after that, every time I saw it in my parents' living room, standing in front of the bay window, it made me feel proud, as if it were a shiny trophy that I had won back. Last week, I sent a tuner over to my parents' apartment and had the piano reconditioned for purely sentimental reasons. My mother had died a few months before, and I had been getting things in order for my father, a little bit at a time. I put the jewelry in special silk pouches. The sweaters I put in moth-proof boxes. I found some old Chinese silk dresses, the kind with little slits up the sides. I rubbed the old silk against my skin and then wrapped them in tissue and decided to take them home with me. After I had the piano tuned, I opened the lid and touched the keys. It sounded even richer than I remembered. Really, it was a very good piano. Inside the bench were the same exercise notes with handwritten scales, the same second-hand music books with their covers held together with yellow tape. I opened up the Schumann book to the dark little pieces I had played at the recital. It was on the left-hand page, Pleading Child. It looked more difficult than I remembered. I played a few bars, surprised at how easily the notes came back to me. And for the first time or so, it seemed, I noticed the piece on the right-hand side. It was called Perfectly Contented. I tried to play this one as well. It had a lighter melody, but with the same flowing rhythm, and turned out to be quite easy. Pleading Child was shorter but slower. Perfectly Contented was longer but faster. And after I had played them both a few times, I realized they were two halves of the same song.